riot in Woodlawn in the mid-'60s that gives you a sense of just the racial.
I thought that the Blackstone Rangers had quelled those riots. I think it was after King got killed. It was like a lot of racial riots going on, and they really went rampant out west. But in Woodlawn, I heard that the Blackstone Rangers was helping to protect and secure the community.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. This was in '65. So yeah, a little bit earlier. But it was small. Yeah, I mean, in general, the South Side, for those reasons, in part, did not have the kind of conflagrations that the West Side did. And some of that also had to do with the ways that these older black neighborhoods had much a kind of more classic denominational church organization. And a lot of these storefronts in those neighborhoods had been cleared due to slum clearance and urban renewal. A lot of that old territory was now being redeveloped into housing projects. And it was really these new neighborhoods that, even though they were ostensibly more middle class, it was where a lot of storefronts were moving in as black people were moving in, and churches were buying property or trying to buy property. So it's actually helpful to think about in a sense. Like, you had older churches like Pilgrim Baptist Church, Olivet Baptist Church, that had been really the centers of black Christian organization in Chicago. They were still prominent in the older Bronzeville wards. But in the newer areas, you didn't have that kind of long-standing black church organization. So there were areas that storefronts had a lot more kind of independence from the traditional black church structures. And so because of that, a lot of black churches that opposed Daley were actually based in these new areas. And so a lot of storefront churches were at the forefront of trying to find ways to organize against Daley, and also against the ways that some of the black church hierarchy was indebted to the Daley regime. And again, because the storefronts had certain things in common with the smaller old rural churches, they didn't have the same kinds of relationships to these larger financial organizations that the larger churches did. So they were not beholden to Daley and to the Chicago machine in the ways that a lot of the larger churches were. And so Woodlawn is kind of interesting in that regard because it's kind of an in-between case. Actually, and this is related to because Woodlawn was at the center of one of maybe the most interesting example of the illusion of integration, because as Woodlawn churches were integrating, they would, for instance, invite Martin Luther King to speak. And they would say that, hey, we are an example of the possibilities for integrated worship, integrated religious life. But in Chicago, Martin Luther King had said that 11 a.m. on a Sunday is the most segregated hour of the year. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference did not really respect black religion in Chicago. It viewed it as being distanced from the strength of kind of traditional black Baptist Southern religion. And so because of that, King viewed the North as kind of an example, an opportunity to try out, can integrated religious life really work? And so he was very amenable to thinking about black religious life in the North as best served if it's integrated, whereas he didn't necessarily feel that way about the South. And Stokely Carmichael was talking to King once, and he said, Martin, I don't understand it. I'm out here talking about black power and getting all kinds of help for it. But everyone loves you, even though you're leading the biggest black organization in the country. You're leading a black church that's basically all black. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is essentially all black, and no one seems to mind. So that kind of shows you that interesting kind of paradox in the civil rights movement, where you had these all black churches that very much wanted to remain so. And yet they were engaged, obviously, in this project of racial integration, but they viewed the North as the place to try that out in terms of religious life. And so they would say, invite Martin Luther King to speak. However, this is at a time when Woodlawn is transitioning from white to black, and at a time in which Woodlawn and its religious leaders are deeply connected to the University of Chicago and its attempts to essentially engineer urban renewal in order to push black people out of Hyde Park and into Woodlawn and elsewhere. And so basically because of this, integrated churches could become a kind of screen that would indicate that Chicago was this kind of locus of integration, when in fact it was the locus of urban renewal. This was a little bit earlier when King was alive, but this process basically would then move from Woodlawn as it was integrating to these other neighborhoods to the west as black people, as the rate of black migration expanded westward and southward. So, yeah.
I don't want to take you too long.
No.
Could you say a little bit about what the riot was, the 66?
Oh yeah, 65. I don't know a lot about it, but it was interesting because King had come to Chicago in 65 just to march, and there have been a lot of marches around racial inequality in 65. But there was always some kind of tension in terms of, was King going to bring peaceful marches, or was he going to kind of instigate riots and things of that nature. This was particularly the case after 1965, when all of a sudden King became trapped in trying to find ways to distance peaceful civil disobedience by youth from rioting by youth. And so he tried to kind of find a bunch of ways to do it, but it was very difficult for him, in part because he did subscribe to a lot of the theories about black family life and about black pathology that were being used to denigrate the movement. And so it was difficult for him to kind of figure out how to kind of thread that needle. And those kinds of difficulties were one of the reasons why the pro-civil rights formation in Chicago was so kind of, relatively easily captured by the Daley regime. It was very difficult to kind of disarticulate things that they wanted to defend from things that they were critical of, when on the ground it was just very hard to do such things. And they were using a lot of, interesting social science, let's say, to justify their political critique at the time. So, is that helpful? Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to know, what was the hateful type of degenerative opinions that was put towards the African American community at this time? That they was trying to denigrate what King was saying when it came to the black family.
Sure. So March 1965 is a very interesting date for King in this regard. Because on one hand, March 1965 is the month of Selma. It's arguably King's greatest moment. But it's also the month that the U.S. government publishes it's often known as the Moynihan Report, the Negro Family, the Case for National Action, which basically argued that black people were not in the political, socioeconomic, and so on condition that they were in because of racism, because of various forms of racial discrimination, and so on and so forth. Rather, it was because they claimed that the Negro family was matriarchal within a patriarchal society, and that because of this, black families were not equipped to achieve the kind of patriarchal social organization, the kind of the kind of father-led, breadwinning families that would allow them to integrate successfully into society. And this became one of the dominant ways for mainstream commentators to think about not only the rise of Black Power and the rise of rioting, but also the mainstream civil rights movement. And so the kinds of youth activism that, say, in Birmingham during the children's marches, when black youth were being shot with water cannons and whatnot, the kinds of activism that seemed so heroic just a few years earlier, by 65 were beginning to be interpreted in terms of this pathology. The idea that the reason why these black youth were so politically active was not because they had any kind of ideals to teach the nation or anything like that about democracy and so on and so forth, but rather because they had been raised in this matriarchal society that made them politically kind of pathological in a certain kind of sense. And so when Martin Luther King is trying to figure out how to sustain the civil rights movement after 64 and the Civil Rights Act, after 65 and the Voting Rights Act, he's trying to find a way to make youth activism still seem essentially kind of pro-mainstream American values, even though he also does believe, and articulates very clearly in Chicago, that, and as he said, and this is a direct quote, the Negro male was trapped in a matriarchy. And so he was using this same rhetoric in Chicago as he was trying to figure out how to bring the civil rights movement north to Chicago at a time that Black Power consciousness was expanding. And so all these things made it very difficult to build a kind of coherent movement that would appeal to black youth in a certain kind of way. and so on and so forth. But part of the reason why he was able to do such a thing was because of the idea that that black religious life in Chicago was not authentic in the way that Southern black religious life was. It was also a mark of this pathology, and therefore, because of that, and the storefronts were thought of as a marker of this pathology, and so because of that, he thought that this integrated religious life was the way to secure some kind of productive black religious life in Chicago, because the idea was that the black storefronts were just kind of they were disorganized. They were not connected to these national bodies. They didn't have the kind of politics that King and others would view as progressive, so on and so forth. And so they were thought of as anathema to integrated life. And so even though Mayor Daley and King were at odds, and Mayor Daley and much of the civil rights, the so-called Lakefront liberals and the kind of civil rights movement in Chicago were at odds in many cases, they actually agreed that this kind of small-scale black religious life was problematic and needed to be removed from the city if possible. And so so that's where like the kind of illusion of integration comes into play here. Was that clear?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Yes.
This is purely geographical and not as important. When I came here to South Chicago, I think I was sold a bill of goods. I was told that this was over here, one of the oldest black communities because of the mills bringing strikebreakers in 1919. And also the Bush community, over here a little. But it isn't on your map, it's not on John Clegg's map. So since we're sitting here, did you look at all at the southeast side or no?
I didn't.
I think I'm the one that's off in South Chicago chauvinism land.
There were black communities in like near the far south side and in places like Morgan Park and all Geld already, and so there were black people were not only in the kind of classic Bronzeville area,
we'll figure it out. I know right over here by Brandon, Burley, etc. It's a very old black neighborhood, and there are Haitian churches over there, which neither here nor there, I guess. Storefront.
The Pullman Porters was here early too.
Yep, they were. Yeah.
They stayed in the George Pullman area.
And that was a major part of one of the reasons that people viewed the Douglas, Grand Boulevard, and classic Bronzeville neighborhoods as problematic was because the idea was that they were far removed from the communities that you're talking about, and there was an idea that as black people moved closer to the real industrial centers of Chicago, and then closer to the suburbs, they would kind of get progressively more normalized, basically. But it was thought that one of the things that would make them more normalized was that as they moved away from the kind of classic Bronzeville, they would also become more integrated. And so there was an idea that that neighborhoods south and west of Woodlawn could be the places that could model this kind of integration in the Woodlawn in the late 50s, and then these other neighborhoods in the 60s. And it was a dream that people, or an idea that people held on to throughout that period, even as the geography shifted under their feet, often literally.
I kind of got like two questions.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, one is, what's like communities like the Pullman Porters, what was their religious services being held? Was it in storefronts as well, or was it in an actual church or something? I don't know if you know about that. But all right. Right now, another question.
No.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the Pullman Porters, and I don't know a lot about their religious organization, but they did hold a lot of meetings in some of the older, more established black churches in the south side of Chicago. They would be more kind of in the more traditional kind of like they'd hold them in prominent Baptist churches. the Pullman Porters were very much a bastion of the early black middle class in Chicago, and so it's in those churches that they would be organized through. Because the Porters were a major part of the organization of black life in Chicago, and often storefronts were thought of as forces that were threatening to that life by a lot of people in different political establishments, black or white.
This is the other question, I remember now. All right, so with the housing covenants, I was hearing about even in 1919 event at U Chicago, they're telling me about different housing covenants and how certain communities and areas wasn't allowing like people to move there or maybe even have storefronts. So like with that plan that you was talking about with having black folks in a certain concentrated area and then expanding outward, was that like a governmental plan or was it like another entity like housing entities that's like, all right, well, this is how we're going to ease, integration in or something? Like, was it the separation between local, authorities or the overall, Illinois government when it came to integration and easing, black people into Chicago?
Yeah, no, it's really important. It was all of that. There was an attempt early on in the interpretation of why the civil rights movement ostensibly failed. Why was there a white backlash to the civil rights movement? To basically argue that that the backlash was motivated by racist individuals who were fine with the idea of black civil rights in the abstract, but did not actually want to live with black people. That interpretation totally lets basically everybody off the hook in a certain sense. It lets the city off the hook, it lets all these other organizations off the hook. And organizations that often were, at least on some level, integrated. And so in terms of racial covenants, for example, these were not just kind of deeds that individual landlords or property owners installed in their individual properties. They were very much inextricable from the government, from the city of Chicago. They were very much in favor of racial covenants, and they would use they would also manage covenants and redlining and these other practices very intentionally. What they would do is they would bar black people from moving into a neighborhood, but they would let people who were known as blockbusters sell to black people, and they would be the only people who were allowed to sell to black people. And so what the blockbusters would do is they would come into a neighborhood. They would tell the white property owners, the blacks are about to overrun your neighborhood. They're going to crash the property value. They're going to destroy everything. Sell now, or this building's going to be worth nothing very soon. And so they would get people to sell at much lower prices. Then they would jack up the prices after they were sold, and because those would be the only buildings that black people could buy to move in, then they would sell them at inflated prices. That also meant that the first black people to move into these neighborhoods were often some of the highest earning black people who could move in. And so then as neighborhoods integrated, more and more, say, working class and poor black people would move in. And so it would seem like those people were obstructing this integrated middle class life that had been established, and it was kind of just needed a little bit more time and a little bit less integration in order to succeed. But this was managed very, very exactly. It wasn't just something that happened. There's a reason why so many neighborhoods were virtually 100% white until 1 year, and then 10 years later we're all black. It didn't just happen randomly. It wasn't just a kind of it wasn't just all about kind of individuals and their individual prejudices. It was all very much managed by the city, very intentionally.
So, all right. So was it like some type of housing covenant union or something that mandated, hey, we're just gonna open up our communities to everyone, or was it the government that had issued it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and. It was, and something that I'm still trying to get at, and finally the archives really explain this, but there were battles within a lot of, Chicago was, it's often thought of as a city of neighborhoods, but it was also a city of neighborhood organizations and homeowners organizations. And these organizations were very much tied to local community banks, to savings and loan institutions, and all of these were then tied to the Chicago Real Estate Board. and these were tied to then the zoning board of appeals and Chicago zoning infrastructure, and all these were tied to the mayor's office, the Chicago machine. I mean, all this was one apparatus. And so within these neighborhoods, often, for example, in Auburn Gresham, you had the Auburn Park Improvement Association, and this was a group that was part of an infrastructure that maintained Auburn Gresham as basically utterly segregated until 1960. In 1960, Auburn Gresham was 0.3% black. By 1966, it was basically 34.5% black. By 1970, it was about 66% black. So in 10 years, after this organization, Auburn Park had no black people in it basically for the first 60 years of the existence of the Auburn Park Improvement Association. Then all of a sudden, in 6 years, the neighborhood was a third black. This did not just happen randomly. This happened in part because of different kinds of battles that were going on within that organization in part. And part of that also had to do, and this is something that I'm still trying to kind of get more of a sense of, also had to do with its relationship to these other financial institutions and savings and loans institutions. And so one of the things that happened in 1966-67 was that 3 of the major financial pillars of Auburn Gresham pulled out of the neighborhood. And when this happened, basically, it became it put the bustling commercial district on 79th and Halsted on life support, basically. And these institutions basically consolidated and then moved downtown. And so part of the story here is the relationship between white residential flight to the suburbs and its direct connection to white capital flight downtown to the Loop. But this was all very much part of the same process, and you can't separate these things. Because these are the very same people in these organizations. The same people who are part of the Auburn Park Improvement Association are also involved in these savings and loans institutions. When they move, they're pulling all that homeowners' capital out of the neighborhood, making the neighborhood less viable for these institutions. And so all these things are very much together. So it's not just kind of individual racist homeowners just kind of randomly being offended and leaving. They're also being pressed on by all these larger institutions, including the city itself. So all these things were connected.